So much of what we live goes on inside. The diaries of grief, the tongue-tied aches of unacknowledged love are no less real for having passed unsaid. What we conceal is always more than what we dare confide. Think of the letters that we write our dead.
I'm your host, Deborah Lucero, and today I'm excited that California's Poet Laureate, Dana GIOIA, is here.
Good to be here.
So I think a lot of people would like to know exactly what is a California Poet Laureate?
It's a good question. In fact, that's the most frequent question people ask me. California was the first state ever to create a poet laureate. It happened 101 years ago. Now that's interesting because California felt that somehow to express itself, I think to express the future of California, the beauty of California, that there should be a writer who represented the state. And so it's a symbolic position in some ways. You know, what the poet laureate is a person who represents the power of the imagination, the power of poetry, the power of literature, and we share it collectively. And it goes all the way back to England, which had a poet laureate around the court. And so it's a poet who celebrates the place, who comments on the place.
I think a lot of people are wondering, why do we need one?
Well, it's, I don't know if you need much of anything, but some things are so nice to have. Do we need that cup of coffee? No, but it helps it. What a poet, I think, the reason the poet laureate is important is that literature is important, imagination is important, and those things are actually crowded out more and more nowadays because we're in a culture which is super saturated with commercial entertainment. There's very few chances to reflect, and what poetry is the most concise, memorable, and expressive way that we have of using language. It's a way of talking about what it is to be alive in a way that moves people and people can remember. And so, what a poet laureate is a symbol which exists as part of public life. I mean, the poet laureate is the tiniest part of the apparatus of the state of California. But I think it has, at least in potential, an outsized importance because language is important, imagination and creativity are important. And the other thing, though, is that the responsibilities of a poet laureate are really quite minimal. So each poet laureate, to a certain degree, imagines what he or she wants to do during the time in office.
Now, I understand that the program is part of the California Arts Council.
Yes.
And I was reading a little bit about it, and I was fascinated that our very first poet laureate was a woman back in 1915, as you've mentioned.
Anna Colbreth was the first, poet laureate. And so, it's California has always been, I think, several steps ahead of the rest of the country.
Yes.
And so, and the poet laureateship was created, then it fell into abeyance for many, many years. They would appoint somebody for a lifetime. Yes. And, and very little happened. But about a little less than 20 years ago, the office was revived, and we've had very good poet laureates. And so, part of my challenge was to figure out something that was, hadn't been done, that was exciting to do.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you about, is I understand that each poet laureate can do some kind of creative project. And so what is it that you're doing for the state as part of your creative project?
Well, what I thought would be meaningful is not simply to be the poet laureate, for literary communities, but to try to be the poet laureate for the entire state. And so I've decided that I am going to help create and participate in a literary artistic event in every county in California. There are 58 counties, which is a huge amount of territory. In fact, a couple of politicians in Sacramento pulled me to one side and said, look, people always think they can do this, but you won't be able to do it. But that just made me want to do it more. So I'm going, county by county, and every event is a little different. When possible, I try to get the local champion for this program called Poetry Out Loud.
Oh, we love it.
Yeah, I was, chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts for nearly 7 years. And while we were there, we created as a arts education program, a national high school poetry recitation contest. There's been almost 4 million kids that have now participated in this. No state has bigger participation than California, so it's the most competitive state. And so you go to Sacramento for the championship, you see these incredible high school kids, which reminds us that we do not challenge our teenagers enough in terms of just developing their creative skills, their performative skills. And when you see what these kids can do. So since only one can win the state and go on to Washington, I thought it would be fun, county by county, to bring the champs in and have them strut their stuff. Last night in Siskiyou, I had a young lady from Etna High School come, and she just wowed the audience.
Wow, that's awesome.
It's tough for me because I got to compete with these kids. They got youth, looks, and talent, and what do I have?
Yeah, I hear you. We just started it here. The Shasta County Arts Council started the Poetry Out Loud program last year, and it's been slow because a lot of the teachers, again, you have to work it into the curriculum, and if they're not used to that, there's a little bit of resistance there. And then one of the questions they have, and I'd really love for you to address this, is a lot of the kids want to create their own poetry. Why do we have to learn some dead person's poem? I've literally been asked that. And I would, I've been waiting to ask you that question.
Well, first of all, most of the selections are by living poets, but it's a very different program if you don't have to write the poem, because most kids don't really want to write their own poem and perform it. You'll have a small group of kids that do this, and they have other outlets. They can do poetry slams. They can have their work appear in the high school magazine and things like this. But you have a whole class of kids who, by taking that barrier away, they will participate. You'll have it'll be the athlete who sits in the back of the room and never says anything. It'll be a kid from a non-English speaking household who feels a little uncertain about his or her writing ability, but can inhabit the text. I mean, one of the interesting things is if you go to the national finals of Poetry Out Loud, we've had a huge number of kids who are first-generation Americans that are winning. In fact, virtually all of the national champions have been minorities.
Wow.
And so what I think Poetry Out Loud does is three things. First, it gives you a profound connection with poetry and the power of poetry, because you are taking the poem and you are learning it by heart. You're bringing it into the very center of yourself. So that has a wonderful education in the humanities, just in that one single enterprise. The second thing it does is it gives you access and command, mastery of great language, ideas, and images. This will do wonders for your writing, for your speaking, and I think even your thinking in the future. And finally, it teaches you a skill that will be of benefit in every walk of life, which is the ability to speak clearly and effectively in public. That's good in your personal life, it's good in your professional life, and it's necessary in public life. And those things are different because if you have a kid come and, I'm going to read you my poem, what are you judging? Are you judging the creativity? Are you judging where they are in their life? It becomes much more subjective. And so this becomes a very powerful thing, which is accessible to every kid in high school.
And you mentioned that it's not really poets who may have died, that these are living poets for the most part.
And the kids can pick their own poems. Right. And so they have an anthology. I think it's now 700 poems. And actually one of the most interesting things that happens is the kids read through these things, and for the first time in their life, they're reading poetry, they're thinking about poetry, and then people are fascinated by the poems they choose. Yeah. Because why do you go, why did that kid choose that poem? And you always feel like there's a deep psychic connection. People pay much more careful attention in Poetry Out Loud competitions than they do in a normal poetry reading.
I've been to a couple, they're just amazing, and the kids are amazing, just the way they perform the poems. It's makes you cry, it makes you laugh, it's amazing.
And the other thing is that usually the kid who wins surprises the teacher. It's not their A student, it's not their best behaved student, it's often the class clown. It's the kids that don't have a channel. And what it does in a class is I think one of the things that you want to do in education is create many doorways to success. Right now in an English class, The doorway to success is the person who can write the paper, who can do the analysis. Poetry out loud brings stuff that's not analytical, not intellectual. It's not even writing. It's, in a sense, inhabiting emotions, inhabiting language, recreating experiences. That's a real human skill, but we don't reward it, usually in class.
That's really true. And also, as you said, it just crosses over into so many aspects of life, being able to speak publicly, going and getting that first job, a first interview. All of those are so important.
Yeah, most of the, I've known I talked to hundreds of kids that have done this because, I've been involved with it now for 11 years. And most of them say it's one of the life-changing experiences they've had in high school. Wow. And that's what we're trying to do, is broaden and enlarge the lives of young people through the arts and the imagination.
So going back to your childhood, what influenced you to write poetry?
I'm a working class kid from the rough part of Los Angeles. My dad was Sicilian. My mother was Mexican. No one in my family had ever gone to college. In fact, I didn't even know anybody whose parents had gone to college. Most of the was Sicilians and Mexicans in my neighborhood. Pretty much all adults either spoke another language or had an accent. And yet, in this environment, there were people who loved poetry. My mother had actually known poems because she had to learn them in high school or grammar school. And she would quite often break into poetry. We'd be doing dishes, and she would say, "It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And that maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, and we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee." And I would be there, and a spell was cast over me, and it put me in a different state of being than I was in my normal life. And I felt these things along the fringes of my consciousness open up, possibilities, emotions, intimations of a broader life. And so for me, it was formative. I never thought I would be a poet. It struck me as this was not an elite pleasure, because I didn't know any elite people. It was one of the pleasures that ordinary people had, like playing cards, singing songs, cooking. So when I went to college and they suddenly said, well, the average person isn't smart enough to understand poetry. It's only, the intellectuals like us who can master this. Which I said to myself, that's not true. And so I was always kind of a divided person in college. But once again, I didn't think I was going to be a poet. I thought I was going to be a musician. And finally, when I was about 20, I realized, somehow the music wasn't drawing me, and I frankly didn't have the level of talent that I saw the really great people having. Even my kid brother was just a tremendous musician, and I found myself writing poetry. And at the age of about 20, I suddenly knew that my life work was to be a poet. And it was puzzling because the question is, well, I'm the oldest kid in a poor family. This is not a practical decision. My parents would just, oh my God, they felt I would be a school teacher, which to them was bad enough because they really wanted me to be a doctor or a dentist. They want, poor families, they want some kid, one of their kids to bring them out of poverty, So, so really for the last 45 years, I'm now 65, I've had to deal with the question is, how do you make a living as a poet? And so I went to graduate school, and in graduate school, I realized they were training me to write poetry and talk about poetry in a way that the very people I came from could not understand it. And it just didn't feel right. I don't think Shakespeare did that. I mean, Shakespeare wrote in such a way that everybody from the learned people to the common person could enter his work and somehow participate. So I dropped out of graduate school and I got a job in business. And for 15 years, I worked about a 10-hour day. I came home and I wrote every night. I wrote every weekend and discovered myself as a writer. And then I was actually was very lucky. I became quite well known quite quickly. And when I was 40, I just quit my job and decided to support the family. But because by then I'd paid my younger brother and sister's way through college and stuff. And I just decided to become a full-time writer. And I had some bad years, but it worked. It really worked. I mean, I've been so, so lucky.
Well, I know in 1991 you wrote Can Poetry Matter?
Yes.
And
That's when I was still in business, and
that's what I was wondering. You were still in business at that time. And that got wide acclaim.
yeah, that became internationally famous,
Yes.
and that actually opened the door. And I said, if I'm going to do it, I should do it now.
What about that paper that you wrote had such an effect on the American psyche and even the international psyche? What was the success of that paper?
You know,
And maybe you could explain a little bit about the premise of it.
you know, I wrote a piece that asked some basic questions. I mean, there's never been a society ever which has paid as many people to profess poetry as a contemporary America. We have tens of thousands of people who are professors of poetry, teachers of poetry, creative writing teachers. We even have a poetry foundation. And yet, you know, in 1991, was there ever a society in which poetry meant less to the average person? And rather than say, well, it's, you know, aren't those average people stupid, which I don't believe, I said, well, maybe there's something about the way we do profess poetry, the way we have institutionalized poetry, the way we have, in a sense, tried to, to promote poetry within our culture that isn't working. And I began to look at this and said, well, you know, we've got this little closed world in the university, which is full of literary activities, but none of them reach outside. And so I began to do this. And what happened is that people all over the world eventually said, yes, I love poetry. And I try to, you know, and I can't understand what these people are doing in the university. This article generated more mail than any article in the history of the Atlantic Monthly. And the weird thing, this is back when people actually still wrote letters, is that almost all of the letters were positive. Usually people write angrily letters, and all of the negative letters were written by people in creative writing departments. And so what happened is that it created a conversation about the role of poetry in contemporary society. And I made a lot of suggestions at the end of the article about, you know, bringing, you know, poetry performance in, bringing poetry on the radio, how to bring poetry in TV, mixing poetry with music, you know, and doing things like this. And lots of people adopted those. In fact, I know a number of people who started radio shows because they read the article and they said, yeah, that would be a good thing to do. You know, in fact, Andy Jones, who has, you know, this great radio show out of Davis, came out directly from that article. So I think my article was catalytic, and what I was doing was for the first time, even though I was a poet, making the argument on behalf of the reader, not on behalf of the poet. Because poets, you know, we know what poets' arguments are. I'm not famous enough. I'm not rich enough. Why don't you love me? You know, and those are good arguments. I mean, myself. But the fact is that if you have a literature without an audience, it's a diminished thing. You know, Walt Whitman very famously said, to have great poetry, we must have great audiences too. I don't think he was talking about box office. I think he was talking about there's a relationship between reader and writer, between, you know, creator and audience. And you see this like in a career of somebody like Bob Dylan. They give each other energy, they give each other meaning. And that's what I'm trying to do, is just to bring, you know, poetry back to the people, but not to being condescending, not being simple, but by just making the best of it accessible.
So I guess that was a pivotal moment, maybe, in the history of poetry. For you personally, from there to now, how has that affected you, and how do you see it affecting the country?
Well, you know, my life is so strange. I've been in business. I run the National Endowment for the Arts. I've been working for foundations. Now to my astonishment and gratitude, I'm Poet Laureate of California. So there's two ways of answering that, which is one, by walking out of my job, just quitting cold, deciding to become a full-time writer. By taking that risk in a funny way, it put me on a trajectory that took me through things I would never have predicted. Yeah, I would never have thought I would be in Washington, D.C., trying to save the National Endowment for the Arts, creating what turned out to be the largest literary programs in American history. I would never really have imagined being California Poet Laureate, because at that point, California Poet Laureate was, kind of a quiet little political position. Uh, and so I've been very, very lucky. What I have seen, though, is that American poetry has changed profoundly in the 25 years since I wrote that article, which is to say, thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands of people, took the challenge in that article, and we now have a very different literary culture. The university hasn't changed very much, I regret to say, but there's now a huge literary culture outside of the university, in cafes, in bookstores, in basically art council centers and cultural centers and museums. And now most poets are published and performed mostly outside the university.
Very well put. Well, are there any other writers in your family?
Well, actually, there is. My kid brother, who's the jazz musician, is one of the most, Ted GIOIA. He's the smart GIOIA. And he's one of he's probably. I mean, I don't think he's just my brother. He is the best-selling jazz and blues writer in the world now. He did the Oxford History of Jazz. Did a great book. Anybody who's interested in California jazz, read my brother's book, West Coast Jazz. It's so much fun. It just takes all the post-war history of jazz. But so my brother and I actually are both writers, and I've got my kid sister is in the Navy. She's a Navy captain. She was in Afghanistan 3 times. In an Army billet, but as a Navy. And then my kid brother is a DJ. And so we were a great except for my sister. We were a great disappointment to my parents, who just wanted a dentist, a lawyer, a doctor. They got a poet, a jazz musician, a DJ, and a Navy officer. But they liked the Navy part because my dad was a Navy guy.
Oh, he was. See, so there's some influence there. There's some influence there. And then I just have to know. So, can you actually articulate one of your favorite authors or poets? I mean, is there someone that you go to that actually had a big...
Well, I love poetry. I know lots of poems by heart. And so there's many poets that really, are deep inside of my psyche. Shakespeare. People never say they're influenced by Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare. I mean, if we have any people in the audience who don't know Shakespeare, watch it. That guy's a comer. He's got a future. Robert Frost, I love. W.H. Auden, I love. Elizabeth Bishop was my teacher at Harvard. And her vision of poetry is very influential. Philip Larkin is another one. And California's greatest poet, Robinson Jeffers, who lived in Carmel. People, his home, Tor House, is now a National Historic Monument in Carmel. Jeffers helped me see the natural beauty of California, not in a kind of romantic human way, but in a very stark, natural way. I mean, that's one of the reasons he's sort of the poet laureate of the Sierra Club and the environmental movement. But there's a wealth of imagination, and California is just a wonderful place to be in, because we live in a reality, both the natural reality and the urban reality of California, that has never really been completely captured in poetry. So the future is ours, if we're creative enough to do it.
And I suspect after you go through all 58 counties, you're going to come up with a lot more ideas. Are you being inspired to write as you're going through?
It's an absolutely insane project to say you're going to visit all 58 counties. I mean, because some of them are hard to get to, and everything. But the reason I'm doing this is both because I think that's a vision of what the Office of Poet Laureate should be, but also I want to see them.
Yeah.
I'm a native Californian, but I still haven't seen, all of this. I mean, this state is as long as Western Europe, and it's got, it's deserts, mountains, seas, cities, farms, and it's interesting. I mean, just driving, for a couple hundred miles, you're in what could be different countries, different cultures, different centuries.
Yeah. Well, it's beautiful up here, and I'm hoping that you get to the 22 counties north of Sacramento. Did you know there's 22 just north of Sacramento?
Yeah, and most of them are up in the mountains.
It's a big place.
I had to get new tires last week. No, I'm going to be in every one. I mean, if it, I'm not going to say if it kills me, but I mean, it'll take a lot of planning. But the California State Library, loves this program. We're doing it in partnership, the California Arts Council. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of excitement. And the interesting thing is that when I go to these small libraries, the librarian's not often sure about this. They say, as a poet, every case that, we have an overcapacity crowd. They have to add seats, they run out of chairs.
Awesome.
And because everywhere in California, there are people who love literature. Everywhere in California, there are painters, musicians, writers, and they love the idea of just being able to congregate. When I visit a county, when I speak at a library or I speak at a cultural center, two things happen. One is my presentation, in which there's a poetry reading, but I think even more important is the fact that we've gathered in this place the local writers, painters, musicians, readers, and they actually meet each other. In Eureka 2 nights ago, there was a writer I knew from 25 years ago, and he had just come there. He didn't know anybody. I introduced him to people. Same thing happened in Eureka last night. I introduced poets to one another, which means that the visit is catalytic, and all kinds of things will happen on their own that I don't even know about afterwards as a result of that. And so I think of myself as, in a sense, in a small way, a cultural catalyst.
Yeah, that's a great place to end. And truly, with the TrueNorth Arts and Culture Alliance, these are the types of people that we're hoping to introduce you to all throughout this great True North. That is Butte, Tehama, Shasta, Trinity, and Siskiyou. Thank you. I'm your host, Deborah Lucero.
I'm Dana GIOIA, the California Poet Laureate, and I want to recite a poem about our native state. The poem begins by describing how somebody from back east might see our landscape. And then at the very end, it talks about the way that we see it. California hills in August. I can imagine someone who found these fields unbearable, who climbed the hillside in the heat, cursing the dust, cracking the brittle weeds underfoot, wishing a few more trees for shade. An Easterner especially, who would scorn the meagerness of summer, the dry, twisted shapes of black elm, scrub oak, and chaparral, a landscape August had already drained of green. One who would hurry over the clinging thistle, foxtail, golden poppy, knowing everything was just a weed, unable to conceive that these trees and sparse brown bushes were alive, and hate the bright stillness of the noon, without wind, without motion, the only other living thing a hawk, hungry for prey, suspended in the blinding sunlit blue. And yet, how gentle it seems to someone raised in a landscape short of rain. The skyline of a hill broken by no more trees than one can count. The grass, the empty sky, the wish for water.